Okay, now we're good.
All right, welcome everyone. Again, Bex Mui, she and her pronouns. I'm the director of Stonewall's LGBTQ Education Conference. I'm really excited to welcome you all here for our next event for the virtual series. I have a little bit of housekeeping and then I'll be turning it over to our presenter. So for today, we'll do some introductions. Again, I'll give a couple of housekeeping technical notes, and then we'll be here for the main event, which I will turn it over to Kim to present to you. And then I wanted to also just acknowledge that we do have a social happy hour option for you all if you'd like to, after this presentation, stay and kind of speak to us or get to know each other a little bit more. So for again, a couple of quick notes. One thing is just being mindful of your mic. Please keep yourself muted if you're not in a breakout group or if you're not speaking. We do wanted to have this in a meeting format so that folks can see each other. We can do breakout rooms if it's if we have time, but it does. It is a great just note and reminder to be mindful and keep yourself muted. I wanted to highlight that the chat is your space. So if you have questions, either for each other or for Kim or for myself, please use the chat at any time. I'll also be monitoring the chat while Kim is presenting. So if you have a question that you'd like addressed, we can either surface that if there's time during the presentation or towards the end. And then also video is up to you. I know that this is coming, kind of at the end of a day for most folks and sometimes in the middle of the day for folks. So please be mindful of yourself, of your body, take care if this is one of many, many Zoom meetings and you would like your video off for a time, please take care of yourself. And now I will turn it over to Kim. I wanted to just read Kim's bio. We're so excited to have her here for gender-related research, critical knowledge for educators. Kim Westheimer has led the LGBTQ youth initiatives for the past 25 years, working with local, state, and national governmental organizations and nonprofits to make schools and other institutions more welcoming of LGBTQ youth. Leveraging the power of grassroots activism, community leaders, and research has been critical to her work. Currently the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Gender Spectrum, Kim was also the founding director of Welcoming Schools at HRC. She's the co-author with Jeff Periotti of When the Drama Club is Not Enough, a book that chronicles the lessons learned from the beginnings of Safe Schools program for LGBTQ students in the Massachusetts Department of Education. We're super excited to have Kim here, so I will turn it over. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bex, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited about this presentation and engaging with you about it, and just really thankful to the Stonewall Education Symposium for inviting me to be part of this series. For those who are not familiar with Gender Spectrum, I want to just tell you a little bit about us. We are an organization that's based in the Bay Area. Our mission is to create a gender inclusive world for all children and teens. Just a small little mission that we have. And we do that through things like professional development, both at conferences like this, but also with schools, everything from a 2-hour presentation to something called our Inclusive Schools Network, which is basically a year-long program that people can engage in if they want to really do a deep dive in making change in their schools and districts. We also have a lot of resources for families and for young people. We have online groups for preteens, for teens, for parents. We have specific groups for kids of color. We have Spanish speak groups that are led in Spanish. And so we just have a lot of resources out there you can check out on our website. So I'm not going to go through the whole list right now. I wanted to give you a little sense of the objectives for today. I want this to help you think about how you assess the validity of research. There's a lot out there right now about everything, honestly, and including about trans youth. And sometimes it's just so hard to sort through them. Through this, what I plan to do is help you identify the source of some key misconceptions about gender, and then apply some of those findings to your practice. Couple of caveats, or not even caveats, just a couple of things I like to highlight in getting started. One is that whenever I do a workshop like this, I like to acknowledge, oh, whoops, I'm just admitting someone here. I like to acknowledge that I just assume we're all in different places, and that's okay. I want everybody to feel comfortable. If you want to ask questions in the chat, there'll be time to have discussions. For some of you, this might be a really new topic. For other of you, not so much. And I just want to welcome you all into this space wherever you are in that continuum. Also to say, this is not a comprehensive literature review. This is not my doctorate turned into a PowerPoint presentation, which is probably good for all of us. But I just want to just state that I'm focusing on a couple of very specific pieces of research that I think are indicative of what's out there and that are being used, some well and some not so well. And the other thing I want to say is, as much as I'm a research geek, and I am, that people shouldn't need research to validate our lives. And as much as I appreciate people doing research that is valuable to the field, I think it's important to state that, because there's so much diversity in how we all think about gender, that I want to highlight that while I'm also talking about research, which I think is an important thing to do. So I'm going to try something new now. And I'm going to ask you if, actually, if you could start by all turning your cameras off. I'm going to ask you a few questions. And if you're comfortable, if the question that I ask applies to you, I'm going to ask you to turn your camera on. And I just stopped sharing so that we can all see the screen here. And where's my list here? I'm curious what age groups you tend to work with. So if you work in P through 5 education primarily, can you turn your camera on? So mostly with elementary school and preschool kids. Okay. Some got a few familiar faces here. That's kind of fun. So welcome, Judy. So okay. So what I'm doing? Oh, if the camera on your device doesn't work, which thanks for pointing that out, Tim, you can raise your hand instead of turning your camera on. So again, we're just doing this as an ice-breaking activity and to get a sense of who's in the virtual room. And if you primarily work in K through 8 education, can you either turn your camera on or raise your hand? Trying to see if I can see the hand raises. Okay. If you work mostly with middle school aged kids, either turn your camera on or raise your hand. Okay, we got a few there with middle school. High school aged. Again, this is kind of fun. This is like a little bit of a, light show here. Okay, so we got lots for high school. College aged? Not so much. And if you're a community advocate, as opposed to working in a school, also just turn on your camera or raise your hand. Okay, great. Thank you. One more question, or one more set of questions. If you're a classroom teacher, can you turn your camera on or raise your hand? Okay, we got a few there. Mental health professional in any capacity. Okay. School administrator? District administrator? You're getting the hang of this. This is good. Librarian? No librarians. I love librarians. Health professional? Nurse, pediatrician? Community advocate? I already asked that, forget that. Coach or physical education? Great. Guidance counselor? And anyone who feels like I've left them out. And if I did, you can put that in the chat. I leave anyone else out there? Resource teacher, thank you. Support teachers in 6 through 12. Wendy's always out. K through 12 consultant. Okay, great. Well, thank you. It's just nice to get a sense of who's here. So now I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. If you give me a second. Okay. Thank you for that. That was my first time trying that activity. I kind of liked it. Just a little bit more about gender spectrum and our framework. Our three pieces of how we approach our work. One is to meet people where they are, and that's similar to what I said before about assuming that you're all in different places. We don't approach our work by lecturing at people about what they should know and what they shouldn't know. If they're showing up in our spaces, we assume that folks want to learn, and we want to meet people where they are and move forward together. We also want to acknowledge the intersections of young people's lives. We know that gender is just one part of a young person's identity. And if we don't take into account the other pieces of young people's lives, then we're likely going to leave people out, and particularly those young people who are most marginalized. And so that's part of our approach to gender as well. And then the other thing is to show how gender impacts all of us. This is just not just about making schools inclusive for transgender and gender expansive and non-binary kids. It's really a chance for us all to think about how gender has an impact in all of our lives, both personally and professionally. And we strongly believe that in order to make change, we have to look inward as well as act in the settings in which we work. Another thing that I want to mention that's particularly relevant to this presentation today is that we talk a lot about congruence. And what I mean by that is looking at how, as individuals, our bodies, our gender identities, and the social aspect of our genders are congruent or not congruent. And so when I'm talking about our bodies, I'm talking about the physiology of our bodies. When I'm talking about an identity, it's about how we identify ourselves in terms of our gender. And when I'm talking about the social aspect, I'm talking about how we express our gender, how the world around us interacts with us because of how we express our gender, and when that's in sync and when that's not in sync, and how that has an impact on our lives as well. I bring this up, you'll hear me talking about this a little bit later as well, because I believe that any valid research about gender has to the people doing that research have to be able to understand the relationship between those aspects of gender and take that into account in how they approach their research. And again, speaking of gender having to do with all of us, everyone seeks some kind of congruence between those different aspects of our gender. It's a unique path for all of us. And the idea of having visibility and support in a variety of spaces is really critical in order to help young people and to help ourselves be able to feel like we have that congruence and that ability to move through life in the way that we want to. So why look at research? Research has been a tool that's historically provided support and also harm to marginalized people. While we like to think about research as being objective, we know that whenever human perspectives are involved in designing research, there's a subjectivity in terms of how it's designed, how it's implemented, and how it's interpreted. And I'll say that for myself, I don't pretend to be objective. I come with my own experiences as someone who was gender nonconforming as a child and have clear memories of both painful and joyful notions of what that meant to me as a child. And as someone who often didn't fit neatly into binaries. I also come here with a set of assumptions, I also come here with a set of assumptions about the need to respect and support transgender and non-binary youth. And as much as is there someone else trying to get in? No. As much as I'm someone who likes to weigh all perspectives in a matter, and I really am, to say that my views don't impact how I view research would be disingenuous. And at the same time, I hope that I never promote research that is not done well or that is shoddy just because I want it to support my own point of view. So here's a starting point in thinking about research. One is about parental support and the support of adults around us, around young people. That support is one of the most important variables for the health and wellness of transgender youth. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that actually means later on in the presentation. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends affirming all transgender and non-binary youth of all ages by encouraging them to be themselves, again, starting at very early ages. And these views are supported by many, really all that I know of professional organizations that are reputable in the field. And at the same time, there's still a lot of questions that come up when we think about related to transgender youth and just even the validity of transgender youth and their identities. And some of that research is used in ways that can be tremendously harmful to transgender and non-binary youth. And we're seeing that in particular right now with the waves of legislation that are happening in legislatures across the country that aim to limit the appropriate health care needed for transgender youth who are seeking medical support for their gender. So there's what I'm going to do first is talk about two research studies that have been used in many ways to, oops, someone else is coming in the room, sorry. Two research studies that have been used in many ways to promote the notion that we shouldn't be supporting transgender youth in expressing themselves and receiving both the social, medical kinds of support that they're looking for. And I want to get a sense from you if you've heard about these research studies. So one, I got that backwards. So one is the notion of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Could you in the chat, if you have, just put yes or no if you've heard about the research around rapid onset gender dysphoria. And what that basically is, it's a claim that being transgender is a fad, and that it's particularly among teenage girls who claim to be trans boys. Anyone else want to weigh in there? Okay, a little.
Also got a question if you're willing to share these slides afterwards.
Sure. Okay, so a mix. Many people have, a few people haven't. And then my other question is the research around desistance. And that's research that claims that the vast majority of young people who identify as transgender will revert to their gender assigned at birth if they're not supported in the gender that in their transgender or non-binary identities. Again, if you've heard of it or not heard of it, just a yes or a no. Anyone else? Yes or no? Got some yeses. Got some no's. Okay. My sense is for the folks who haven't heard of this, that you'll, as you move forward, if you're doing more work related to trans youth, you'll be hearing about it. Unfortunately, I would say, from my, again, not completely objective perspective, you will be hearing about this more. So to start this, I'd like to very briefly go through this research assessment tool. And I'm going to go through this very quickly because we're actually going to apply it to the research that I'm talking about. And I want to also tell you up front that after we do this, I'm also going to highlight some research that I think is well done research and how that has an implication on the work that we do with youth. But let's start with this. So it's very simple in thinking about this. It's really about critical thinking, which we're teaching our students all the time, right? Thinking about where was the research published, when, who wrote it, what language is used, and how was it done? Is it peer reviewed? And I don't want to say that peer reviewed is the end all and be all of research. There's some very good community research that's not peer reviewed, but it does provide a different standard if it's peer reviewed, and that's something to look at. Who did the research? What was there? Are they connected to the communities that they're researching? What's the intent of the research and such? When was it done? Does it stand the test of time? Is there more current, more relevant research that something done, say, 15 years ago might be, and you know, I'm someone 15 years ago, doesn't sound like that long ago, but 15 years ago was there research done that then now there's more current research that that should be taken under consideration. You want to look at the key findings and how they're written, the language that's used, and how that language tells you something about the intent of the study. And again, we'll be getting into that a little bit. You want to know about the author, what their biases are. Do they have credibility in the field? And what can we find by looking at the methodology? Is it sound methodology? Who's represented or who's not represented in the sample? That's part of the research. Okay, so with that, we're going to start with talking a little bit about rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I want to start with each of these by talking a little bit about the origin story. So there's one article in particular, the one that's highlighted on the page now, that's credited with the origin of the phrase rapid onset gender dysphoria. It was floating out there in the online world for a while before that, but it didn't gain much traction until this article was written. And give me 1 second here. And so this article, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of paper management moments here. Second. Here we go. Okay, so this article was published in a publication called PLOS One, and it is a publication that is, although it's peer-reviewed, it's considered, it's very different than most of the peer-reviewed journals that many of us are aware of, because instead of focusing on one specific area, like if we're talking about the Journal of, American Medicine or something like that, we know that the people reviewing the article are going to be experts in medicine. If we're talking about a journal of public health, we know that there's public health experts reviewing this. But the way PLOS works is that they just have people who look at it for research, the methodology, without really having a deep knowledge of the content base. And one thing that does is allow them to publish many more papers than journals tend to publish. And it also allows them to, usually when someone publishes in a journal, they don't pay to be published in the journal. But PLOS One, you actually have to pay the journal in order to be published in it. So I do want to say that this doesn't mean that everything that is in a PLOS One journal is not rigorous research, but it just raises a question. And it's one of the things you want to think about. When was it published? The original was published in August of 2018, and it was revised in March of 2019. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, why that was revised. And who published it? It was somebody who was a professor, Lisa Lippman at Brown University, who in an interview talks about being a physician trained in both obstetrics and gynecology and is in preventive medicine and public health, but doesn't have a background in gender, and said that she became interested in gender dysphoria because she was observing in her own community a pattern whereby teens from the same friend group began announcing trans identities on social media, and that parents, and we must have lost somebody who just came back on, sorry, parents were seeing that their kids were becoming increasingly hostile towards their families after this. And so Lisa found these stories compelling and heartbreaking. So already when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, this is someone who's coming from the perspective that being transgender is a problem. And that's the starting place. So that raises some red flags for me as well. And as part of the what Lisa did is define rapid onset gender dysphoria as a type of adolescent onset or late onset gender dysphoria, where the development of gender dysphoria is observed to begin suddenly during or after puberty in an adolescent or young adult who would not have met criteria for gender dysphoria in childhood. Again, this was based on a very small sample that she had of people in her life. And she theorized that this was caused by contagion among peer groups, social media binge watching, and prior existing psychiatric disorders. Again, big statements to make for a very small sample size. And so she has this theory, and we all have theories that we want to try out. And so what she decided she would do is survey people on a variety of different sites to find out from parents if their children had exhibited what she called rapid onset gender dysphoria. And these were the sites that she chose. Now, 3 out of these 4 sites are either openly hostile to transgender people or opposed to any medical intervention for gender atypical youth. That's in quotes. And Fourth Wave Now is opposed to medical interventions for gender atypical youth. And interestingly enough, it was founded by a mother of a teen girl who announced she was a trans man. This is what it says on the website, who announced she was a trans man after a few weeks of total immersion in YouTube blogs and videos and other social media. But what's interesting about this to me is that her daughter, after kind of experimenting some, actually decided that no, she wasn't transgender and she wanted to present in a way that was considered more masculine. And her parents let her do that. And yet, despite that, and that's all on the website, despite that, still have this website, which is very much challenging the notion of transgender youth who want to be themselves. Yeah. Oops, what just happened there? Are you still seeing my screen? Are folks still seeing my screen?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, let me bring it back again.
Seeing you.
Okay. Okay. So and again, the research from the surveys from this, one second. There were 265 surveys analyzed, and there were no data about where participants first heard about the survey. So that's, it's not terribly transparent, let's put it that way. And it makes sense that if these websites were primarily websites that are really centered around not supporting transgender kids, that the parents who are on those websites are parents who are going to be resistant to their kids' identities, and that those kids then are going to be kids who become, as the researchers said, kind of hostile and sullen as they're trying to navigate their gender identities in families that are not supporting them. So, and this second quote here really affirms that, which in affirming the hypothesis that the researcher said that the worsening of mental well-being and parent-child relationship and behaviors that isolate adolescents and young adults from their parents, families, non-transgender friends, and mainstream sources of information are particularly concerning. And again, of course, kids would feel more isolated if they're trying to navigate their gender identity and their gender expression, and they're not getting support from those around them. There was a tremendous amount of controversy about this survey, particularly because young people were never interviewed for this survey. It was just relying on this very select group of parents. And in fact, at some point, Brown University took it off of their website, and Dr. Lippman changed the name of the title at PAWS 1's insistence, I think, saying that, that this study is specifically about parent reports of young people's experience of gender dysphoria. And I just want to give you some food for thought as we move on from this piece of research, which this is a survey, one of the largest survey of transgender people in the US from 2016. And it shows when transgender people looking back said they had an age of realization that their gender identity was different than that was assigned to them at birth. And you can see that the majority of these young people, it was age, or the largest group is ages 5 and under. And then you see as the graph moves forward, for some people it's in their teens and for some in their 20s, but a large percentage had some realization, even if they didn't have the language for it, from when they were at a very young age. But then if we look at the age when this group of transgender people said that they disclosed their gender identity, you can see that the largest group there, over a third, it was when they were age 16 to 20. So while it's valid for parents to be surprised and to have questions if a young person identifies their gender identity to them and it's a surprise, say when they're a teen or something like that, it may not be a case of, sudden rapid onset gender identity, but as to paraphrase Diane Aronsoft, who's a psychologist who's been doing work in this field for many, many years, that it may be rapid onset parent awareness more so than rapid onset gender dysphoria. Okay. I was going to take some questions here, but I think I'd like to get through, well, I'll take just if there's a couple of questions at all. I'm happy, just anything that folks want to clarify. And if not, there'll be another chance if you don't want to right now. I just want to make sure that there's nothing that's confusing about this or something you want to ask about. And I'm with educators, so I feel like I have to do a little bit of wait time. And going once. Okay, let's keep moving. This one's an even quicker one, I think. So this is about the question of desistance. And again, I'm going to start with the origin story of this. Basically, this has come from two gender clinics, one in Toronto and one in the Netherlands. These stats have been going on for years, decades, I think, at this point, citing, and it's often cited to say that up to 80% of transgender children identify as cisgender in adolescence. And if you think I had problems with the other study that I just went over, I have even more problems with this one. And there have been a series of articles that have been written about this. I just have a couple of them up here right now. So when did these come up? It really spans a time period between 1995 and 2013. And again, this is where I would ask the question, what research has happened since then? What has changed in the field? But that's not even the biggest questions. The biggest questions are really about the bias of the folks who did this research, as well as the methodology that they used. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but Kenneth Zucker is a person who, a psychologist who used to run the a gender clinic in Toronto that as a kind of a direct quote here that was used to promote encouraging gender dysphoric and non-conforming children to build stronger friendships with same-sex peers and play therapy, where one can understand better a child's internal world and why they might feel that it's better to be of the other gender. His real goal, and he said this very clearly, is to help parents help their children be able to identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And then Thomas Steensma is a little more complicated in many ways. Oh, I should also mention that the gender clinic was since shut down because it was seen as practicing conversion therapy. So Thomas Steensma is a Dutch psychologist who also worked at a gender clinic. I'm going to get into the methodology, which he still stands by, but at the same time, he distances himself some from the methodology and the conclusions of it, because he said that the study was never designed with the goal of showing how many young people are actually desist from identifying as transgender. And just to be clear, when I'm talking about desistance, I'm talking about a child who identifies as transgender or non-binary or a gender other than the gender they were assigned at birth. And that, for some time identifies as another gender and then goes back to the gender that they were assigned at birth. That's what we're talking about when we're saying desistance. So the methodology they use, I never can quite wrap my mind about it because it seems so simple and also in my perspective, a bit wrongheaded, and I'm never quite sure how it got the validity to get out there in the way it did. But what they did is looked at youth who started accessing services from gender clinics and then measured how many continued treatment and how many did not. And one of the reasons that's problematic is that what they found, and again, I'm going to take this apart a little bit, that the majority stopped seeking treatment and counseling from the centers. So they took that the fact that young people stopped seeking treatment to mean that meant that young people who were transgender were really cisgender. And again, we haven't done any language. Cisgender meaning identifying with the gender that they were assigned at birth, and transgender mean that not identifying. It's been used to say that young children with gender identity disorders, so to speak, should be prevented from gender nonconforming activities, and that young children shouldn't socially transition in any way through clothes, names, or pronoun. And it's used to criticize the use of puberty blockers. But I want to take that apart a little bit. And this is an article that I recommend from the Journal of the College of Family Physicians of Canada that does a really good critique of this. So, as I said before, youth who didn't follow up in the clinics were categorized as cisgender. That was more than 30% in one study. But there's a million reasons that youth might not have followed up at the clinics. It could be that they just decided they wanted support from someplace else. It could be that their parents didn't support them in continuing to receive services. It could be that they moved. There was no tracking of the young people. It's just the fact that they didn't show up meant they were put in the cisgender category. Non-binary identities were completely ignored. And gender non-conforming youth were classified as transgender. So if a 5-year-old kid went in there who was assigned male at birth, and liked to play with dolls and maybe wear dresses, they were identified as transgender. And we know gender doesn't work that way. That's about, again, when we go back to the 3 components of gender, that's the social component of gender. That's about how someone expresses themselves. That has nothing to do with how they might identify then or later in life. So these are huge gaping holes in research that has really done quite a bit of damage. I'm going to skip this slide for time. And then another critique about this is it doesn't take into account the benefits of support and the harm of suppression to young people. Again, I'm going to get into talk briefly about a research study that shows us very clearly the importance of support for transgender young people. And if we're talking about harm reduction, it's really critical that young people are supported in their gender identities, and there's no apparent harm for that. And in fact, research says very clearly that young people who are supported in their gender identities and gender expression have a much more positive outcome in terms of their mental health and just their well-being in the world. Again, parental support is a key piece of that. And I apologize for rushing a little bit in this because I want to make sure I get to this research as well. I wanted to pick out at least one research study that really counters the two, because the first time I presented this, I just presented the other two, and somebody said, "So, is there any research that shows something different?" And so I'm picking this one because it's such a simply designed study, and it so clearly gives us a different perspective on what is helpful for transgender and non-binary youth. So you see this headline, "Using Chosen Names Reduces Odds of Depression and Suicide in Transgender Youth." It's a research study headed by Stephen Russell. It was from October of 2018 and in a peer-reviewed journal. Here's a little bit about Stephen, and I confess that I have known Stephen for some time and was really looking to see if there was something critical I could say about him or that had been written about him, because I'm trying to be fair and balanced, and I couldn't find anything. He's someone who has just done a tremendous amount of good work in the field and has been recognized for that work. So this was, again, a very simple hypothesis that the use of transgender youth's chosen names in these 4 contexts by parents and caregivers, close friends, teachers, and school overall would be associated with decreased depression, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior. So again, instead of trying to figure out ways to deny a young person's identity, which is essentially what those other two studies do. This was looking at what actually, when you affirm a young person's identity, what's the outcome? The how was, it's not the largest research study in the world, but it's valid, reliable, tested scales, and it's a racially diverse and age diverse group of young people. And what he found is that the use of something as simple as the use of chosen names in just one of the 4 contexts listed there on the left were associated with a 29% decrease in suicidal ideation and a 56% decrease in suicidal behavior. And that each time you added another context that was supported, those numbers shifted in, became higher. So again, a very, very clear research, very elegant research design, and showing a very different outcome. And while I said that this would not be a literature review, I did want to just highlight a few things that, as I've been spending time with the research, as a way to think about it, and also as a take-home message, I think, for all of you. If in your work you come across people who are arguing for some of the outcomes from those first 2 research studies, as far as I can tell, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, that research focused on youth well-being and mental health, that all of it that I've been able to look at, finds that youth who are affirmed for their gender identity and expression in multiple settings, whether it's in schools or homes, are more likely to thrive and significantly less likely to suffer from issues related to mental health, including suicidal ideation. And in fact, that their mental health outcomes are very similar to cisgender young people. And this is research that's really intentionally looking at the well-being and mental health of transgender students. And across the board, it shows that support is a positive thing for young people. On the other hand, research used to convince schools, families, and others to deny young people's gender fundamentally in some way question the ability of young people to know their gender identity. And as we saw in some of the earlier slides, the ability of young people to know their gender identity is affirmed by mental health organizations, and by people's experiences, by the experience of young people, by the experience of families, by the experiences of people who work with young people. And I want to put a little caveat in here. This doesn't mean that young people might not explore different gender identities. That happens too. I don't want to make this all black or white. But again, exploring gender identity is actually more of a positive thing than a negative thing. And in a society in particular, where gender diversity is not always supported, and where gender identity is also the language around gender identity is evolving, it makes sense that there will be this kind of exploration, and that's something that can be supported with absolutely no harm for young people. And then, as I said before, the ability of children and teens to know their own gender has been affirmed by all reputable professional mental health and psychological organizations. So I want to just end before we get to questions by sharing a short video, just under 4 minutes, that to me, it makes kind of the research I just talked about come alive, because I want to just be able to show, here's what it looks like in a school that's doing, it's a middle school that's doing everything it can, I believe, to support transgender students and to have conversations about gender. This comes from the Illinois Safe Schools Coalition and was a video that they created highlighting the school that they had been working with.
At the start of this process, we surveyed all of our students and staff, and we wanted to get a sense of what people were feeling. I think when we surveyed our teachers, we found that our teachers are looking for some direction. They're looking for administration to say it's okay to talk about these topics in our classrooms.
Students were coming to me with these issues, and I didn't always feel comfortable giving them the information without, and feeling like I had the district support.
The Berwyn School District has passed an administrative procedure that really protects the rights of transgender and gender expansive students in the district. It establishes a gender support team that's really guided by a student's self-determination and self-expression of what they need to feel safe. including how that student wants to be referred to in the student database, preferred name, preferred pronoun. There's also protections around a student's access to gendered facilities and confidentiality around how their transgender identity is disclosed and to whom.
The purpose of the gender support team is just to make sure that in a positive way that the student has an opportunity to go through their daily academic life in a safe, respectful way.
My school makes me feel included and makes me feel like I am somebody, because it's very hard for other people to come out in school especially. So they make me feel very happy and enjoy school. The way I felt to be a part of it was just so amazing, how I could support Isaiah in this journey and how I finally saw my school come together and every single person of the teachers and staff help Isaiah be who he is and not be scared of who he is. It's interesting to know that my friend is transgender, and it really lights up my world to know that I have a different type of friend.
In a school environment, when you can acknowledge that there are different viewpoints, that there are different people, that there are different cultures, I think you are doing your best to reduce some of that hate and that violence that surrounds many in our community.
I think it's very important for school materials, curriculum, to have examples of families that reflect same-sex couples as well as LGBT identified parents. That way it says to the student that your family is a family. It affirms that.
I think it's important for them to see these changes in school because it validates them. It makes them feel like they belong here.
I think what we're seeing is more and more districts are acting proactively to pass administrative procedures, guidelines, and policies so that we aren't at the risk of an individual teacher or an individual principal needing to make a decision about an individual student without guidance.
I think it's important for other districts to do what we're doing because it's in the best interest of our children.
It's not like the diversity of our communities are going to change. And the longer you resist, I think you're just sort of doing a disservice to your students and making them feel less safe in their own environment, in their own classroom.
Well, like if you don't agree with someone's like sexual orientation, don't like bring it out in harsh words. Like you're gonna have to accept them eventually because it's their choice.
If I had all these role models or access to facilities or even the choice of what line I wanted to be at just to go get lunch, she would have made a world of difference when I was 11.
Okay.
At the start of this process,
Oops. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm going to actually stop sharing, which I did. And just any questions, comments, thoughts, anything. And you can do that with your cameras on or off. You can talk, you can do something in your chat, whatever you'd like to do. Yeah, Gina.
I'd like to jump in that I've recently done 3 professional development trainings in my community, in our catchment area. I work as a board member for GLSEN, one of the professional development people. And it's interesting, in all 3 talks before we came in to talk to the teachers, all 3, and this is coming from administrators, is that they are afraid to bring this kind of conversation up because of how the parents are going to react. So I really liked that video. I think that, you know, for administrators to see other administrators and how they're dealing with it, and that might be a really good way to go with helping them figure things out.
Absolutely. And I think that is, you know, I've been doing work in this field for a long time. And I feel like that's always been part of the struggle, is to help people get over that hurdle. And I agree that having administrators talk to other administrators or see other administrators who have done this work is critical. And that also helping them develop the language in a language that they understand, so that that idea that this is about all kids, that this is connected to the well-being of kids, that this is about you know, the social emotional learning for kids, that is really about creating an environment for all kids. And I also, the other thing, and this is harder to convey, I think, is that there are more schools that are doing this kind of work without any kind of pushback. There are a lot of parents who really want this to happen as well. And people get really scared because what makes the 6 o'clock news is not the schools where things are going smoothly. What makes the 6 o'clock news is where there's controversy. So building some support in the school, so that the administrator knows they're not alone, for them to hear from parents who want this to happen, for them to be able to develop networks of support. I think those are all key pieces of that as well.
I agree. I think, and of course, I'm from the Bible Belt. I don't know where other people are from, but I think so many adults think it'll just go away if they just ignore it. But instead, it's making it so much harder for my trans students and just the LGBT students, because they don't feel like they're loved and accepted for them. Instead, they feel like they're being made feel like it's a sin and everything else. And it's becoming, some of them are really commenting that it's a struggle in school because teachers refuse to accept it or refuse to use pronouns that are accurate on what they're going through. And even if they are, you know, exploring their gender and whether they're happy, and even if they decide they'd rather stay what they are, you know, teenage years are a time for exploration, a time to find yourself. But yet the LGBTQ kids are being told it's not a time for that. You know, you can explore anything else, but not that.
Right.
And maybe that's a bigger problem here in the Bible Belt. I don't know, but it is a big problem, and they don't feel safe in their classrooms, and a lot of them because of negative feelings towards their choices. Whereas, you know, if teachers and parents could just understand it's their choice, you've made a choice, and the kids don't agree with your choice. They don't think yours is right. But, you know, they're not fighting back quite as much, I think, as parents. And some adults are fighting back, trying to make them change. And, you know, there are still places down here in the South that definitely are trying conversion therapy. They call it different things, but it's still there.
Right. And again, if we look at this in terms, I mean, we could do a whole workshop also on strategies for change, which Gender Spectrum does in many different ways. And we have tons of resources on our website that I also want to encourage you all to spend some time looking at. And again, you know, that kind of gets at that. I know that in terms of time, we don't have that much time to go into that right now, though, Becca, maybe we can go 5 minutes later or something like that. But I also know we have some other really seasoned folks in this workshop, and I see that Tim has his hand up, so I'd be curious to hear what you want to say, Tim.
Thanks. I just wanted to say that I think it's like a very specialized training, and not just the training in terms of research and facts and things like that, but more so in modeling. And you kind of already said this, Kim, a little bit around language. But what people don't have at different levels, whether it's a classroom teacher, whether it's a principal, whether it's a central office leadership person, or a parent, many of them don't have the words to be able to express things in a way that would still be considered a safe zone, right? A lot of them think you mention something and it's extremely triggering, and the way you respond was just going to trigger somebody. But really training them on the words they would use by modeling those in a training for them is really critical for when they respond to a parent. So if somebody says something like, well, I don't want you doing that. Well, just simple, and we're talking simple modeling here. We're not talking about extensive responses. We're talking about how do you say something to that person so they can't respond back with another thing, because it's inclusive of everybody. So you're saying that basically we service everybody. We treat everybody the same in our district. It's our responsibility to make sure everybody's safe, all those kind of things. But a lot of times I feel like we give all this stats and information, but we fail to give them the actual language they need, and not like not like generic language, but very specific modeled language for them, so that they feel more comfortable being able to express that at those different levels, because it's a different conversation at those levels. Even though some of it will be the same, it is a different conversation in tone, depending on that. The video is wonderful and great, and I wish all schools could do something like that, so that young people can see that, and so I use my, and also I think there's a component to that for students and unity. And I'll use my niece as an example, who's non-binary and goes to school in Texas and moved there from Utah, and has been horribly bullied, thrown in trash cans, and just horrible things have happened to her, to the point of suicidal ideation, other things that have happened over the last couple of years. And I was extremely worried about Texas, but a couple weeks ago, she was pulled out of the lunch line because she had a pride button on. And the principal said to her that she can't wear it. The principal pulled her out of the line and said she can't wear it because it promotes something, like it promotes some cause, and you can't wear that kind of thing. So of course she went and reviewed the 97-page policy they have and couldn't find anything on it. And of course I, as an uncle, got really angry and was ready to call the school and to do all those things that I know about. But the next day, what ended up happening was she had put it on social media. Everybody from her school had seen it, and a bunch of people, including football players, the next day all came to school wearing a pride button to support her. So those kind of things are really important, but also giving young people those tools as well of how to advocate for each other, because sometimes you're friends with them, but you don't know how to support them.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a wonderfully inspiring story too, Tim. Thanks for sharing that. And I just want to be clear that in this presentation, the goal here wasn't to have, that you would go back to your schools and then, kind of explain the research to people. It's more that it's a foundational understanding of how research is being twisted essentially to harm transgender and non-binary students. And that that idea of developing the language and to be able to have those conversations and to model things like that school in Illinois, that's really critical. This is really just what I tried to present today was really much more sort of kind of a foundational set of information, because we keep getting questions about that. People keep asking us about this research in particular. Judy, I see you're raising your hand.
Well, actually, I am one of those people who shows up at the research. And I really do think that the research is very valuable in supporting our work, because otherwise, if we just come forward and say, this is what feels right for us, just as much somebody else is going to be able to come forward and say that this is what feels right for them. And so I find that the research to be really helpful in being able to substantiate and validate the work that we do. And I'm glad that you raised those two articles, and specifically, those are what I was looking at, because I had parents who were supportive of their kiddos, read that research and wondering if they should withdraw their support. So the parents were, even our supportive parents were really struggling with that. And so, being able to critique research, I think, is really important. We have to be able to look at it and wonder if there's, what kind of bias, and look at the methods, because I think it's what gives us credibility. And I really appreciate that you took that critical stance with all kinds of research, because if we can't defend our actions, well, I guess the more languages that we can use, and research being one of those languages, the law being another language, and just the heart being a third language, the more that we can have congruence with all of those approaches, the more effective that we're going to be, and kind of this multi-level, multi-entry point interventions.
I love that framework of what was it? Heart, legal, and research. That's great.
Research, yeah.
We're gonna have to work on that one. I like that. That's great. Thank you. Other questions? If I can take maybe one more. I'm looking at Becca a little sheepishly, but yeah. If there's any other questions or comments. Okay. Well, thank you. I just want to also say, I don't have a slide up with my contact info, but if folks do want to contact me, you can do that here. I just put it in the chat, and I'll also put the, oh, that's not my, that was wrong. Let me try that again. That's not even my Gmail. And okay, and then also the Gender Spectrum website. Really does. I mean, I have to say the Gender Spectrum website is just filled with resources that I know some of you out there have used, and some of you out there have helped us develop as well. So I'm looking at people like Judy and Tim and Diana and Bex, all who have been really valuable partners of ours over the years. And then also to just say that we have, I'm just going to put a plug in for a symposium that we're going to have on July, I think 16th and 17th. It might be 15th and 16th. It's one of those days. You can find it on our website, and it'll be a 2-day symposium focused specifically on youth and gender. And we have a growing roster of presenters that looks really great. And so definitely check that out as well. So. Thank you. And Bex, again, thank you for setting this up, and to the Stonewall Center. Really great to meet all of you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Really appreciate your presentation. And I can see from the chat and everyone's nodding and smiling faces that we're all really grateful for what you've shared today. If you don't mind stopping the recording, I think that this has been great. And I will be sending out, I'll send Kim's contact information along with the Gender Spectrum